Janet Marie Chandler was born the only daughter to parents Jim and Glenna on May 29, 1956. She grew up in a very conservative and deeply religious Christian family. At the age of 22, she was pursuing her bachelor's degree in music vocal education at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, and hoped to one day become an opera singer. She was living off campus in an apartment and working the night shift as a motel clerk at the local hotel, the Blue Mill Inn. She was described as easygoing and friendly, but when she started working at the Blue Mill Inn, she started living a double life. Janet's parents were very surprised by her decision to take the job at the motel and weren't exactly happy. Her roommate and so-called friend Laurie Swank was a supervisor at the motel and had gotten her the job. In 1979, the city of Holland was being ripped apart by a dramatic and violent strike at the Chemetron paint plant. On one side was the Teamsters Union, and on the other side was the Wackenhut Security Company, which brought in guards and strike breakers. Ground zero for the strike breakers and security was the Blue Mill Inn, and the group consisted of around 80 men and women. But not only was the motel ground zero, it was also party central, and locals started to describe it as a swingers club. Janet's parents despised the motel and had warned Janet about the dangers of working there, and they felt her skills could be put to better use in a different field. Janet had worked in childcare and studied in nursing jobs that suited her strong nurturing side, but she was adamant and eager to start making her own money to gain independence. Just after 2 a.m. on January 31, 1979, Robert Lynch, a guest at the Blue Mill Inn, called the police to report a robbery at the motel. On the phone, Lynch claimed he had been on the phone with the motel's night clerk when he overheard a man with a deep voice barge in and demand money from Janet, who was working the front desk that night. He described hearing Janet pleading, "Please don't take it all, sir." A witness would see a vehicle outside but hadn't got a good look at it. They believed it could have been a dark-colored, four-wheel drive, possibly a Jeep. When the police arrived, Janet was gone. Her purse was missing, her coat was draped over her chair, and her half-smoked cigarette smoldered away in the ashtray. Police couldn't immediately rule out the possibility that Janet had voluntarily left the premises. Still, January was Holland's coldest month, and the snow blanketed the town. It seemed very unlikely that she would have willingly gone out into such grueling conditions without her coat. Also, the front door, which was electronically controlled, was unlocked, which was strange because Janet was meticulous about keeping the door locked at night. The motel had strict security procedures requiring employees to lock all doors after dark, so access to the front lobby could only be gained by buzzing an electric intercom. Her alleged abductor had also taken $300 cash from a bank deposit bag in the back office and $200 from a cash drawer. It was fast becoming clear that Janet had been abducted by the robber, who might have ordered her to take her purse with them, assuming it contained money or other valuables. But if the perpetrator just wanted a quick cash grab, why take the night clerk with them? In the parking lot, police saw 2 sets of footprints in the snow leading away from the hotel to the getaway vehicle. Robert Lynch was among 80 visiting guards from the Wackenhut security firm that the plant had hired to protect their property and keep the non-striking staff safe. The picketers and the Wackenhut strike detail, who had essentially taken over the Blue Mill Inn, did not get along. Most of the guards lived outside of Holland, and the Blue Mill Inn became their temporary home. The security guards worked intense 12-hour shifts, and the dive bar next door provided the perfect place to blow off steam. The bar became a meeting place for the Wackenhut guards, the strike breakers, and local single women. Despite the large number of guests staying at the Blue Mill Inn on the night Janet was taken, there were no actual witnesses to the robbery or abduction. All police had to go on was the description of the deep-voiced man overheard confronting Janet and the sighting of a dark-colored four-wheel drive. By the following morning, whoever had taken Janet had not attempted to contact her family or claim a ransom. Police knew time was of the essence, and if they wanted to find Janet safe and sound, they needed help knowing where to look. The only potential clue lay in another incident before the robbery and abduction occurred. A 20-year-old female employee had clocked out for the night at a liquor store just 3 miles away. As she was leaving the building, a young man attempted to grab her and drag her into his car. The woman managed to fight him off and escape and reported the incident to the police. She described the assailant as a white male around 18 or 19 years old who was 5 foot 8 inches tall with long stringy brown hair and glasses. Police wondered whether the same man could be responsible for Janet's abduction. As a result, a composite sketch of the suspect was distributed as investigators attempted to determine whether the two incidents were related. In addition, another potential link surfaced in the city of St. Joseph. A four-wheel drive was stolen during a break and entering at a residential address. Police were looking for a green over white 1975 GMC four-wheel drive Jimmy with Michigan license plates that bore striking similarities to the vehicle seen at the Blue Mill Inn. Officers around the district were alerted to be on the lookout for the GMC Jimmy. On January 31, 1979, Janet's parents were notified of their daughter's disappearance. Much to their dismay, they were asked whether there was anyone Janet might have run away with, but her parents strongly rejected this possibility. If Janet had up and vanished in the middle of a shift with no explanation, they knew something terrible must have happened. Her father, Jim, was so disappointed with himself because he had previously visited his daughter at the motel and had noticed some questionable-looking characters loitering in the lobby. It had made him feel uncomfortable, and he now wished he had questioned it even more. Nevertheless, the Chandlers were advised to stay put because the roads were icy and very dangerous, and the police already had a snowplow out looking for any signs of Janet. A roadblock had also been set up to try and prevent any vehicles from leaving town without their occupants being questioned. However, Jim ignored the advice and immediately jumped into his car and began searching for his daughter. When Janet's younger brother Dennis discovered what was happening, he also joined his father in the search. The next morning around 1 a.m., February 1, 1979, her body was sadly discovered in the snow by a snowplow driver in a wooded area off Interstate 96 outside of South Haven. Her body was on a snowbank beside a turnaround near the exit to the town of Covert. There had been an inch of fresh snowfall overnight, and it was the plower's job to keep the interstate clear for motorists. As his headlights illuminated the snow-covered road, he noticed something strange in the highway's median strip near the turnoff to Covert. Fresh tire tracks in the snow led into a heavily wooded area, so the snowplow driver got out into the freezing night air and followed the tracks. The tire tracks brought him to a snowbank out in the open underneath a fir tree. This is when he saw Janet Chandler's deceased body. A medical examiner determined that she had been sexually assaulted and strangled to death. Her clothes and belongings were all missing, including jewelry, a wristwatch, a billfold, and her driver's license. Unfortunately, in 1979, there was no way to connect outside DNA found on her body to an assailant. There had been 5 inches of snow in the past 24 hours since she had gone missing, but she was only lightly dusted with snow. Furthermore, the tire tracks showed that she had only been dumped shortly before the snowplow driver had discovered her. Therefore, it was determined that Janet had only been killed approximately 6 hours before her body was found. However, the case was way bigger than the small Holland Police Department could handle. Complicating matters further was the fact that the abduction occurred in Ottawa County, whereas Janet's body was found in Van Buren County. This meant that different departments were responsible for various facets of the investigation. Dozens of detectives and uniformed officers were brought in from out of town and helped coordinate a major search of the area where Janet's body was found. Canines and helicopters scoured the area, but not a single piece of evidence was found. Motorists were asked to report any vehicles seen parked near the covert turnoff between 9 p.m. Wednesday and 1:30 a.m. Thursday. However, nobody came forward, but a potential breakthrough occurred when the green and white GMC Jimmy, stolen from St. Joseph's the night before Janet's abduction, was recovered. The thief was revealed to be the owner's 18-year-old grandson. The tires on the GMC Jimmy were compared to the tire tracks leading to the snowbank where Janet's body was found. However, they were not a match, and the stolen GMC Jimmy was ruled out of the investigation, but police remained adamant that a four-wheel drive of some sort had been used in Janet's abduction. News of Janet's murder utterly shook the small town and terrified Hope College students who feared a killer targeting young women was on the loose, and they were advised to be extra cautious. Encouraged by a $1,000 reward for information leading to an arrest, tips came in from all over the country. One concerned citizen was in a bar when they overheard a group of men boasting about their involvement in Janet's murder. Yet when the police looked into the report, they concluded the drunken men were joking in very poor taste. Janet had been brought up in a wholesome family, and most of her friends were from church. Although she had dated men in the past, Janet's family said she had no serious boyfriends. They couldn't think of anyone who would wish to harm her, and it seemed she didn't know her abductor as she was overheard calling him Sir instead of his given name. Some locals believe that the person responsible was among the local community. 2 weeks after Janet's murder, the strike at the plant ended and the Wackenhut security guards scattered back to their hometowns. Things quieted down around Holland, but the investigation into Janet's murder continued around the clock. By July, 5 months had passed and investigators were still no closer to solving the case. The reward for information was bolstered to $3,000 in an attempt to boost the dwindling tips that were coming through. Police questioned and re-interviewed Janet's friends, family members, co-workers, and people staying at the Blue Mill Inn at the time of the murder, but they couldn't find any evidence to show that Janet was targeted. They also wondered why her best friend and roommate, Laurie Swank, a manager at the motel, hadn't been working on the night of the attack. Swank said she couldn't think of any guest who would want to harm Janet. Around half a dozen persons of interest emerged during the investigation, some of whom were subject to polygraph testing. Still, none were concrete suspects, and there wasn't enough evidence to make any arrest. With no leads or suspects, the case would sadly go cold. The case was reluctantly shelved, but members of the Holland Police Department refused to let it go. A photo of Janet was pinned to a communal bulletin board so they would always remember the case. 12 years later, in August of 1991, a 34-year-old vagrant named Donald Leroy Evans was detained in Colorado on suspicion of raping and murdering a 10-year-old homeless Mississippi girl named Beatrice Roth. Upon his arrest, Evans not only confessed to his crime, but he also made a shocking revelation. He claimed to have killed 72 people across the US and Canada, saying that most of his victims were taken from road stops or public parks. It wasn't unusual for killers to confess to crimes they didn't commit, and Evans had no evidence to back up his stories. In addition, he claimed most of his alleged victims were either homeless or involved in sex work, making it near impossible for police to investigate every single one. That was until Evans claimed responsibility for 2 unsolved murders in Florida in 1985 regarding the deaths of 38-year-old Ira Jean Smith and Janet Movich. Evans was able to provide details that only the killer could know. Evans' claims that he was a prolific serial killer didn't seem quite as questionable. A special FBI task force was established to sift through hundreds of unsolved murders across the United States to determine if Evans could be a potential suspect, and Janet's case was among the files. Evans was a drifter who constantly moved from state to state, and it was soon revealed that in 1981, he lived at least 3 different addresses in Holland, Michigan. For Holland police, this was the best lead they had uncovered since Janet's murder 12 years earlier. Yet a further dive into Evans' history failed to reveal any information that placed him in Holland in January 1979, so once again they were at another dead end. The case remained dormant for nearly 3 decades until an associate professor of Hope College in Holland wanted to keep things interesting for his communication students. He thought it would be useful for his students to establish good relationships with law enforcement. In 2003, he organized for his class of 8 students to meet with a detective from the Holland Police Department, a 30-year veteran of the force who was about to retire. During the meeting, the professor asked the detective if there was one case that he wished he could solve. The detective didn't hesitate and pointed to the photo of Janet Chandler that had remained pinned to the police bulletin board for over 20 years. The professor's interest was immediately piqued and an idea started churning in his head. He thought, what if his students made a film about Janet Chandler's life? Not necessarily intending to solve the case, but as a means to keep her memory alive. He figured they could speak to Janet's loved ones and people who worked on the case, and at the very best, it might uncover some new leads. If not, it would still be a fascinating educational tool for students that would also pay tribute to a young life that was tragically lost. The project, titled Who Killed Janet Chandler, was given the green light, and with only 4 months to complete the documentary, the professor's students quickly got to work scheduling interviews with old investigators and Janet's parents and siblings. 21-year-old student Sarah Hartman was tasked with interviewing Jim and Glenna Chandler at their home. The elderly couple would speak lovingly about their daughter, and they reminisced about past memories of her. Even though 24 years had passed since Janet's murder, her parents were still grieving. The professor's students became personally invested in Janet's case and spent hundreds of hours researching everything they could about the crime. They also interviewed everyone from Janet's former music teachers to detectives who had attended the Blue Mill Inn on the night of Janet's abduction. The more they found out, the more committed they became to discovering the truth. They also discovered that everyone who worked on the case had a different theory about what happened on that cold night in 1979. When the documentary was screened at the Knickerbocker Theater on January 30th, 2004, Holland Police Chief was completely enthralled. He had been a young member of the Holland Police Force at the time of Janet's murder, and like so many other officers, the case continued to haunt him. The students' documentary had sparked renewed interest in the case by the chief. The chief contacted Michigan State Police, who held jurisdiction over Janet's case. They agreed that the murder was worth reinvestigating, and who better to take the lead than a veteran of the force who had been a young officer at the time of the murder and remembered the case well. In April 2004, a task force was officially formed with 3 officers from the Michigan State Police. Since Janet's murder, they had no DNA or fingerprints to go on, leaving them to rely on good old-fashioned police work. So they gathered all the original case notes and decided to start in Holland and then work their way outwards, beginning with Janet Chandler herself. They wanted to learn more about who Janet was when she was not with her family and teachers. So they began talking to people who moved in the same social circles as Janet and discovered that shortly after she enrolled in college, something shook her entire Christian beliefs. While Janet had previously viewed premarital sex as a sin, she had met a middle-aged man who convinced her otherwise. Before long, they were meeting at her parents' house regularly to have sex. Their relationship went on for over a year. Still, Janet's parents never found out about it. Janet soon realized that she could sin without ever being punished for it. Suddenly, her world started to open up and she began experimenting with alcohol, marijuana, and dating. With investigators now having a clear picture, they were keen to speak to the person who likely knew her best around that period, her best friend and roommate, Laurie Swank. Laurie had left Holland shortly after Janet's murder and hadn't maintained contact with many people since then. Swank was now working as a nursing assistant 630 miles east in the small town of Nescopec, Pennsylvania, when detectives surprised her with a visit. Swank divulged that she and Janet had been having sexual relations with several Wackenhut security guards whom she described as a wild group who loved to party. Things had even gotten out of hand on one occasion when Janet had summoned one of the guards to the front desk. When he came down, she was waiting for him in an adjacent display suite, wearing only a pair of cowboy boots. Swank, who was technically Janet's boss, had no choice but to give Janet a stern talking to. The more detectives questioned, the clearer it became that the motel had been a hot spot for partying. One investigator described it as a place where the guests and staff could drink, take drugs, and have sex without any supervision. Therefore, it made sense to assume that someone with connection to the motel could have committed the crime. Investigators compiled a list of all the guests staying at the Blue Mill Inn at the time of Janet's murder. The majority had been Wackenhut security guards, and many of them had left town without ever being questioned by police. Tracking them down 25 years later wasn't an easy task, as most had lived transient lifestyles, moving from one job to the next. The investigative team began traveling the country to question those of interest time and time again. However, the response was always the same. Most of the guards said they barely remembered Janet. Their time in Holland had been spent working grueling 12-hour shifts, and after their shifts, they retired to the Blue Mill Inn to eat and sleep before doing it all over again the following day. On their rare breaks, they blew off steam in the dive bar located next door to the motel or threw parties in one another's rooms. The former guards were shown the documentary in hopes that it might jog old memories, but nobody knew anything about Janet's murder or had any information that could help with the investigation. That was until Harry Keith watched the film. Harry had worked as a security guard for Wackenhut, but had also been a keen photographer during his stay at the Blue Mill Inn and was a roommate of Robert Lynch. As a result, he had taken his camera out on several occasions. Watching the documentary, an emotional Harry recognized one of the photos of Janet as the one he had taken, and it wasn't the only one. Harry retrieved an old photo album, and inside were pages of photographs taken back during the strike in 1979. They featured the wild alcohol-fueled parties that the investigators had heard about. In one photo, Janet sat on a guard's lap with a drink in hand, wearing a guard's uniform. One guard was featured in several photos and caught the investigators' eyes. There was an unverified rumor that this individual might have been involved in Janet's murder. That man was Robert Lynch, the guest who had called 911 at the Blue Mill Inn on the night Janet was abducted. Robert Lynch had been nearing 40 during his time in Holland, making him one of the oldest Wackenhut security guards. Detectives tracked Lynch down to the small Michigan town of Three Oaks, 80 miles south of Holland. He had lived quietly as a handyman with his wife and had raised 3 children in the decades since Janet's death. They had no reason to believe that the now 65-year-old Lynch was involved in Janet's murder, but Harry's photos revealed they knew one another. Furthermore, detectives had some new questions after re-listening to the audio of Lynch's 911 call. Despite reporting what he suspected to be a robbery in progress, Lynch's voice sounded curiously emotionless and left investigators wondering if the call was possibly staged. If Lynch knew anything about Janet's murder, he wasn't talking. Instead, he gave evasive answers, telling detectives he had very little memory of his time in Holland. This was credible, given that he had a serious drinking problem with no evidence tying him to the crime. Lynch would remain a person of interest while the cold case team continued questioning other people in the case, but their minds always returned to Lynch. Maybe it was just a hunch, but they couldn't shake the feeling that he knew more than he was letting on. He was questioned several times, but was adamant that he didn't know anything about Janet's murder. On the surface, he appeared to be a committed family man with no serious criminal record, but his drinking habits suggested a man trying to drown his sorrow. The detectives hoped that if they continued pressing him, he might finally give them what they were looking for. In June 2005, Robert Lynch finally admitted that he and Janet had been intimately involved despite him being 17 years her senior. The two had sexual relations at the Blue Mill Inn and met at a vacant house for a rendezvous. That wasn't all. When Janet was killed, Lynch heard that she had attended a party with some other security guards that had gotten out of control. He claimed not to know anything else about it, but for the cold case team, this was a huge revelation, and for all the people they had questioned, this was the very first time they had heard anything about such a party. Still convinced that Lynch knew more than he was letting on, the lead detective visited him again. Over a week later, Lynch was in a somber, reflective mood. He began speaking about his father's death before suddenly blurting out that he regretted his entire life, but he didn't want to talk about the things he had done. The detective asked Lynch if the reason he drank was to forget, which Lynch replied, "I'm running from everything," and then he went quiet. It felt like the breakthrough the investigators were waiting for, but they figured Lynch needed more time. The detective returned to Three Oaks 3 months later to interview Lynch again. This time, he was accompanied by his partner who specialized in interrogation and was known for his ability to break suspects. This time, they brought a copy of the documentary Who Killed Janet Chandler. When the documentary came to the part where Janet's father was shown fighting back his tears, the detective paused the DVD, turned to Lynch, and asked if someone had killed his daughter, wouldn't he want to know who did it? Lynch's eyes welled with tears and his lips quivered. It took 4 months and a total of 18 interrogation sessions before Lynch finally admitted exactly what he meant when he said Janet had attended a party that had gotten out of control. He explained that just before 2 a.m. on January 31st, 1979, Lynch and another security guard named James Nelson, who went by the nickname Bubba, made their way down into the front lobby of the Blue Mill Inn, where Janet was working behind the desk. Nelson had some exciting news. A surprise party was being held in Janet's honor. It was taking place at the residence of Arthur Paiva, the head security guard living in a guest house on the grounds of the plant. Janet stepped out from behind the desk, and the two security guards pinned her arms behind her back and placed her in handcuffs. According to Lynch, Janet had no problems with this. He said that she believed their story about the surprise party and allowed the men to blindfold her by duct tape and gauze over her eyes. However, it was Lynch who came up with the idea to stage a robbery, with Janet being unable to see. They quickly pocketed the cash from behind the front desk in the adjoining office so that it would look like the motel had been robbed. Nelson then walked Janet to a waiting car outside. Several other security guards and female motel employees were standing on a balcony overlooking the front lobby. As Janet was whisked away, they watched with full awareness of the plan about to unfold. With Janet safely off the premises, Lynch called 911 and made the false report about overhearing a robbery taking place. When the police arrived, he told them the front desk clerk was nowhere to be seen. Needing a few hours of sleep before his shift was set to start the next morning, he went back to his room and went to bed. The next day, Lynch worked his shift as though nothing had ever happened. First, he paid employees their daily allowances while taking care of other clerical duties. Then, after clocking off at around 6 p.m., he quickly freshened up and made his way to Arthur's place. Approximately 15 to 20 other guests were already there, 6 of them being women. Janet Chandler was among them, naked and sitting on a couch. Her eyes were glazed over as though she had been drugged. Her hands were still bound, and her mouth was sealed with duct tape while the party continued around her. Music played as several partygoers drank and smoked marijuana, and one of the security guards danced around in his underwear. A docile Janet was paraded around the room as the other attendees mocked and shamed her. Then one of the other attendees, Freddie Parker, who was also a security guard, fastened his belt around Janet's neck and led her to an upstairs bedroom. Several of the guards followed and lined up at the bedroom door, and Lynch was one of them. The group then threw Janet onto the bed, and one by one they took turns sexually assaulting her. Freddie Parker watched at the door and decided who was permitted to enter, and Arthur had the last say on who was allowed to participate. As Arthur assaulted Janet, he yanked on the belt and shouted, "You're going to die." James Nelson, Robert Lynch, and Freddie Parker followed his lead, assaulting Janet with the belt until she was barely conscious. While all of this was taking place, no other guests at the party did anything to intervene. In fact, they actually encouraged it. One of Janet's female friends was among them, but Lynch couldn't remember her name. As she watched the guards assault and beat Janet, her friend looked directly at her and called her derogatory names. Eventually, after all the men were done, Robert Lynch got on top of Janet and used his knees to pin her down on the bed. He continued to assault her and then tightened his hold on the belt until she stopped moving. When it was clear that she was no longer breathing, he ripped the duct tape off her eyes. The room erupted in panic, and Arthur threw a chair against the wall and yelled the party was over. Aware of what had just happened in the upstairs bedroom, most partygoers pitched in to help clean up the crime scene. They knew the police were on the hunt for her, and they wanted to get rid of her body as quickly as possible. Several guards washed her down before Lynch and Williams wrapped her up in a sheet and loaded her into a car under the cover of darkness. Lynch then drove 40 miles south to the snowbank where Janet was ultimately found. 2 weeks later, the strike ended and the Wacken Hut security guards were no longer needed. The men left town, vowing never to speak about what had happened during their time in Holland. Instead, they allegedly operated under a code of silence, maintaining the unofficial Wacken Hut company motto, I know nothing, see nothing, and speak only in kind words. Many of their paths never crossed again, but Lynch's involvement with Janet's murder followed him wherever he went. Finally, in the end, he would turn to the bottle, desperately trying to erase the night from his memory. The truth about what happened to Janet finally revealed one last question. Why did the group intentionally take Janet's life in the most brutal way possible? Lynch initially claimed he couldn't remember the name of Janet's friend who had witnessed and encouraged the attack, but as he was pressed further, he recalled her first name was Laurie. With Lynch's confession now in hand, the detectives once again confronted Laurie Swank. They couldn't understand why Janet's supposed best friend would not only watch as she was viciously sexually assaulted, but also encouraged it. Swank continued to deny any knowledge of Janet's murder, and the detective gradually turned up the heat, stating, "You saw Lynch kill her, didn't you? Tell the truth, give up the battle, give up the fight, and tell me you saw it. You were there when she died, weren't you? That's why you ran." No longer able to hide the truth, Swank finally broke down and admitted to being part of the plan all along. It all started when Janet began sleeping with a security guard who was already romantically involved with one of the Blue Mill Inn's maids. The maid was furious, and she and Janet had a loud confrontation. At the time, Swank had feelings for Arthur, the head security guard who was living at the guest house. However, it was soon brought to Swank's attention that Janet had also been sleeping with Arthur, and Swank became angry. Wanting revenge against Janet, she confronted Arthur and told him he wasn't the only guard Janet had been fooling around with. This information enraged Arthur, who in turn said he would take care of it. He then began speaking to other guards and maids who felt wronged by Janet, and they hatched a revenge plan. They hoped it would humiliate her and teach her a lesson. The group believed Janet thought a lot of herself and needed to be brought down a few notches. Arthur, Lynch, Swank, Nelson, and 3 other guards gathered in the motel lobby and discussed how to proceed. They decided that the men would convince Janet they were taking her to a surprise party in her honor, and once she agreed to go, they would call Swank to come in and take over Janet's shift. From there, they would take her to Arthur's guest house, take turns sexually assaulting her before eventually taking her life. As they devised the details, it was clear that the men were excited about putting the plan into action. Swank entered the bedroom to find Janet naked and bound on the bed. When the attack was underway, she watched as the guards took turns sexually assaulting her. Swank looked right at Janet, verbally abused her, and cheered the men on after witnessing Robert Lynch pull on the belt that ultimately killed Janet. Swank said she feared for her own life, but vowed to never tell another soul what had happened. Maintaining her innocent facade, she attended Janet's funeral, as did Arthur and James Nelson. Swank left Holland shortly after, hoping to leave the secret behind, but like Lynch, it followed her wherever she went. As the years passed, Swank considered coming clean, but feared what it would mean for her relationship with her family. Finally, after Lynch's confession, she decided to tell police the whole truth. After Lynch and Swank's confession, other witnesses at the party also lifted their veil of silence and admitted their knowledge of the crime. One of Arthur's former girlfriends at the plant, Patty Ward, admitted she had lied when providing an alibi for him on the night of the murder. She claimed Arthur had forced her to say he was with her, warning she would end up dead on the other side of the road if she didn't comply. Ultimately, it took the cold case team nearly 2.5 years to uncover the full truth. One thing that continued to astound them was how many people had either participated or witnessed the attack on Janet, yet remained silent for almost 30 years. A witness who worked as a maid at the Blue Mill Inn provided some insight. She claimed that some of the guards who were involved threatened to kill anyone who spoke out over the years. They even paid her visits randomly to demand she keep her mouth shut unless she wanted to end up just like Janet. The same thing happened to all 6 women who attended the party that night. Another explanation for the ongoing silence was the possibility that incriminating photographs existed of the attack. A photographer named Ronald Wyrick, who Wackenhut had assigned to capture images of the strike, had also attended the party. Arthur asked him to attend the party at the guest house to take photos. He ended up with photographs of some of the men assaulting Janet. Wyrick later testified that Arthur wanted to make sure he had photos of him and Janet together. He said he later gave the 24 exposure roll of film to another guard who supposedly gave it to Arthur. Wyrick recalled that Janet was drifting in and out of consciousness and occasionally attempted to break free. Wyrick also claimed that everyone at the party knew about the photos and feared Arthur could use them against them if they ever went to the police. However, a search of Arthur's home didn't uncover any of the photos. If such photos existed, they were never found. Robert Lynch, Laurie Swank, Arthur Pava, James Nelson, Freddie Parker, and Anthony Williams were each charged with 3 felonies: first-degree murder, committing murder during the commission of a kidnapping, and murdering during the commission of a criminal sexual conduct. They were each facing a mandatory life sentence with no chance of parole. At the time of Arthur's arrest, the 54-year-old was still living in Muskegon, the same city the Chandlers lived in at the time of Janet's murder. He had been there ever since the strike ended. Now divorced with 2 children, he denied having anything to do with the crime and claimed he wasn't even at the party. He told one reporter he couldn't believe anyone would say he was there. The other accused men also denied their involvement. 59-year-old James Nelson was living in West Virginia with his 2 autistic sons. When police approached him and placed him under arrest, Nelson admitted to having sexual relations with Janet, but denied having anything to do with her murder. 49-year-old Freddie Parker, who now walked with a cane due to diabetes, claimed he moved to West Virginia 9 days before Janet's murder. Not only was this disproved by multiple witness statements, but an ex-girlfriend of Parker's, who worked as a maid at the Blue Mill Inn, said she heard him loudly bragging about his involvement in the crime. The 5th and final guard, Anthony Williams, was extradited from Wisconsin and also claimed he wasn't at the party when Janet was killed. Robert Lynch agreed to provide a full detailed confession in exchange for a second-degree murder charge. Subsequently, he was sentenced to 40 years in prison with a minimum of 25 years. When Lynch was allowed to speak, he mumbled, "I hope the family rests in peace, and I ask forgiveness from Janet." In exchange for the lesser charge of second-degree murder, Laurie Swank agreed to testify against the guards at trial. Even with Swank's testimony and Lynch's confession, the other defendants still pleaded not guilty and maintained they weren't at the party and didn't even know about the crime. With no DNA or physical evidence tying the accused men to the crime, the case would have to rely heavily on Swank's testimony. On October 17, 2007, Swank took the stand and spared no details, fully admitting to her role in the plot. Swank admitted that she was motivated by jealousy as Janet was more popular with the guards than she was. Swank's testimony was bolstered by 2 former Blue Mill Inn maids, Cheryl Ruiz and Diane Marshman, who knew of the plan and attended the party. Arthur's ex-girlfriend Patty Ward also testified. Each of the women named Robert Lynch, Arthur Pava, James Nelson, Freddie Parker, and Anthony Williams as being involved. Even though in Robert Lynch's confession, he noted that Janet's eyes had been glazed over during the attack as though she had been drugged, a toxicology test found no drugs in her body. Also, nobody ever testified that she was given drugs. It was determined the glazed look in Janet's eyes was most likely due to shock. It was determined that as many as 12 guards participated in the attack on Janet, but only Arthur, Nelson, Lynch, Parker, and Williams were charged since they had the strongest evidence against them. In the end, the jury would find all 4 defendants guilty of 2 counts of felony murder. Arthur was convicted of first-degree murder, while Freddie Parker, James Nelson, and Anthony Williams were each convicted of second-degree murder. The 4 men sat stone-faced. Freddie Parker's sister was so emotionally overwhelmed that paramedics had to come to her aid. Each of the 4 men subsequently attempted to appeal their convictions, arguing that the witness testimonies had been unreliable and that there was no physical evidence tying them to the crime. However, all of their appeals were denied. In 2013, Arthur passed away in prison on his 61st birthday after serving only 5 years of his life sentence. In 2016, Swank was released on parole. 3 years later, in June 2020, James Nelson also passed away from natural causes. That left just 3 of the 6 individuals convicted of Janet's murder behind bars as of early 2022. Professor David Schock was so affected by the outcome that he left teaching and founded an organization called Delayed Justice, in which he used his film and research skills to shine a light on other unsolved crimes. In 2010, a year after the trial, Jim and Glenna filed a civil suit against the Wackenhut Security Company, accusing the company of negligent hiring and supervision of their employees. They attempted to sue the Wackenhut Corporation for damages relating to mental pain and anguish, funeral expenses, and punitive damages. They argued that several security guards were unfit for employment and the company was negligent in failing to run adequate background checks or provide suitable supervision. However, the case was dismissed in part of a technicality which stated that as per the Michigan statute, the lawsuit to recover damages for the death of a person should have been filed within 3 years of the incident. In a 2008 interview with NBC's Dateline, Jim and Glenna were asked if they thought justice had been served for their daughter. Glenna answered, "Yes, for Janet. These others have to live with what they did, and we know where she's at, and we know that she's with our Lord." However, Jim disagreed and felt that justice had not been served.